In the province of Nova Scotia, there was a maternity home. For most during this time, a maternity home represented a place of peace where one could give birth with the support of caretakers. But unfortunately, the ironically named Ideal Maternity Home was no such place. Unknown to the unfortunate mothers who went there for aid, evil lived within the walls. Murders, kidnapping, and infant black market trading are just some of the crimes that took place within this building. This is the horrifying true story of the Ideal Maternity Home. A quick warning before I go into the story of the Ideal Maternity Home. This documentary contains information that may be highly sensitive to certain people, so if topics of death and kidnapping make you uncomfortable, viewer discretion is advised. Otherwise, enjoy the video. Before we begin with the Ideal Maternity Home, we first need to talk about its founders. Lila Gladys Coulon was born in Fox Point, Nova Scotia, Canada in 1899. Not much is recorded about her early life, but we do know her parents Salem and Bessie Coulon were devout members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which, to put it simply, is a branch of Protestant that lived through a strict code of ethics that prohibit alcohol, smoking, and recommend a vegetarian diet to its followers. They also differ from typical Christians, as they believe Sabbath, or essentially rest and worship day, falls on a Saturday rather than a typical Sunday. At some point during Lila's high school education, she decided she wanted to become a teacher, and after graduation, she did just that. Lila worked as a teacher in Fox Point, and at the age of 25, she met William Peach Young, who was a self-taught medical missionary for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. William had spent a lot of his time preaching along the south shores of Nova Scotia, and was originally born in the state of Oregon. The two fell in love, became married, and moved out to Chicago together in December of 1927, while Lila was expecting her first of 5 children. Shortly after, in 1928, William graduated from the National College of Chiropractic. That same year, Lila graduated from the National School of Obstetrics and Midwifery. For those who don't know, obstetrics is a branch of medicine that deals with the act of childbirth and the care involved for women after the birth is over. Midwifery is another umbrella term that covers all the aspects of care before, during, and after childbirth. After both of the newlyweds had gained their education, they moved back to Nova Scotia, where they founded the Life and Health Sanitarium. Originally, this building served all those who were sick and provided them a place to rest and recover. Lila and William had put nearly everything they owned into the building, and it's said that they barely had enough money to buy the patients cots to sleep on. But within a year's time, business had improved and the sanitarium had made a dramatic shift into something completely different. You see, Lila had experienced great success in her maternity care, and as a result, the Life and Health Sanitarium was changed to the Ideal Maternity Home. William acting as a superintendent and Lila as the director. But this business was about to take a dark turn that would scar the area of Nova Scotia for years. Let's lay out some important facts that are crucial for understanding how this seemingly innocent maternity home took a dark turn. In the year of 1869, Canada had passed a law making abortion and birth control methods illegal. It was a serious criminal offense prior to 1969 that would be punishable by life in prison. Also notable during this time was the fact that if any unmarried woman was to get pregnant in the 1920s, the same time the Ideal Maternity Home was in business, they would be socially ostracized. For most cases, families would disown a woman who became pregnant outside of wedlock. In Nova Scotia, the city of Halifax became a massive international hub of trade during World War I, bringing many sailors and soldiers into the city for a few days or weeks at a time. As a result, you can imagine that many unwanted pregnancies occurred. This trend continued into the 1920s, as the coal and steel trade out of Nova Scotia was also fairly large. This is where the Ideal Maternity Home came in. Lila Gladys Coulon was also a fairly successful midwife at this point, and she began to capitalize off this trend. Women began to flock to the Ideal Maternity Home when Lila released ads in the paper that read, "Ideal Maternity Home, Woman's Refuge. No publicity, infant's home and connection." Women that came to the maternity home were typically billed around $75 for birth care and the weeks following for recovery. But unmarried women who went there for secretive birthing were charged higher rates, typically $100 to $200. Adjusted for inflation, this comes out to about $2,700 on average in today's money. Keep in mind that during this time, the average wage per week was $48. This shows how steep these prices actually were. Not to mention, Lila also charged an additional $20 for a funeral charge if the baby was to die within the maternity home. This alone seemed profitable for Lila and William, but that wasn't enough. The real money was when they sold the babies. The two would also take unwanted infants and sell them on the black market. This was typically to Jewish families from the US who were fed up with long wait lists for Jewish adoption centers. This was due to the unbreakable rule in the US and Canadian adoption centers that children must be placed in families with the same religious affiliation. Lila and William would lie to them and tell them that the infant had come from a Jewish family. These families would be clueless to the fact that the babies they were adopting were in fact illegally sold, and parents wouldn't ask too many questions as they were receiving the extension to their family they so desperately wanted. Others seemed to refute this statement, and instead explain that the families knew the babies were not of Jewish origin, but were so desperate for a child of their own, they didn't care. Babies would typically sell for $10,000 each, and as a result, Lila and William began to rake in serious amounts of cash. So much, in fact, that their once small building that was barely able to afford a handful of cots for the patients had now expanded into a 54-room complex. But all things considered, minus lying about religious backgrounds to families seeking adoption, Lila and William hadn't done anything to deserve the dreaded intro to this video, right? I wish I could say they didn't commit any horrific acts, but that's simply not true. Lila and William had begun to participate in some horrific and unforgivable actions during this time. First of all, the prospect of selling babies was so enticing to these two that they began to do it on women who wanted their baby. Picture this. A lady comes in to give birth, they go through the process, and she eventually gives birth to a healthy baby boy. Lila goes off to care for the child, but returns a few hours after and informs the woman that their boy, unfortunately, has passed. Unknown to the mother, the baby never actually died, and Lila fully plans on selling him to another family seeking out a baby. Not only would she pocket the money from the mother who has to pay the bills for her services, but she would also have to pay for the funeral service charge now. Lila and William would also pocket the money for selling the baby, making this horrific action highly profitable. And profit they did. Between 1937 and 1947, it's said that they pocketed around $3.5 million from their illegal actions. This comes out to around $76 million in today's money. Not to mention, Lila and William also hit a stroke of luck during World War II, when Halifax once again became a major port for the war efforts. Sailors would once again spend a handful of days there, and as a result, as many of you can imagine, the rate of babies born out of wedlock began to rise. But this isn't even the extent of their crimes. Surely not every single baby was easily adopted. Well, Lila and William had a diabolical plan for this as well. According to online sources, roughly 400 to 600 babies were deliberately killed over the span of the Ideal Maternity Home's time. These children were typically seen to Lila as, quote, unmarketable. Many of them were either sick, disabled, or of mixed race. These babies were fed a diet of molasses and water, typically over the course of 2 weeks, until they starved to death. Then caretakers of the complex would pack the deceased babies into butter boxes from the local Le Havre dairy and bury them on the property, hence the name Butterbox Babies. It's also said that some of these babies were simply tossed into nearby rivers, as to dispose of them quickly. Lila and William also reportedly got a bit sloppy with their methods and began to cut corners around their business. To do this, they cut cleaning costs in the complex, and over the next few years, the home had begun to grow so unsanitary that it became a big risk for mothers and their babies to even be in the building. This caught the attention of a man in the public health department in Nova Scotia named Dr. Frank Roy Davis. He would then begin an investigation on the two. In 1934, the Nova Scotia Department of Public Welfare had collected enough evidence to attempt to shut down the maternity home, but this unfortunately would fail. In the following year, in 1935, Lila and William were convicted with fraud due to charging childcare expenses for a dead child. As a result, the maternity home fell under nearly constant supervision, but due to Lila and William's connections with local politicians and those who had used the maternity home services, they were able to defend themselves against these accusations and stay in business. the year of 1936, a woman named Eva Nyforth came to the Ideal Maternity Home just before Christmas. At this point, Eva was 9 months pregnant and desperately needed aid, as she had conceived her child outside of wedlock with a drifter. Lila and William took Eva in, but shortly after, she contracted an abdominal infection. This resulted in Eva being confined to a cot and being unable to move much. Her birth soon followed, and was reportedly agonizingly painful due to her infection. On top of this, Eva was informed shortly after that her baby had died, and within a day her infection had grew due to the fact that the maternity home had no antibiotics on the premises. Eva's boyfriend Walter arrived at the Ideal Maternity Home after he received a letter addressing Eva's condition from William Young. Upon arrival, William was shocked at the sight of his girlfriend. Eva was in horrible condition, and as a result, he pushed for Lila and William to call a physician he knew from East Chester. William, likely to not draw more attention to the maternity home and its squalid conditions, assured him that they were doing all they could, and that he was, self-taught, already a doctor, so there was no need for that. So William convinced Walter that all was well and sent him off on his way, but not before charging him $20 for the funeral service fee for his girlfriend's child. Not long after Walter left, Eva succumbed to her infection, and as a result, manslaughter charges were filed against both Lila and William. This was due to the squalid and disgusting conditions the two had allowed the maternity home to fall into while trying to cut costs. A mortician even went on record and said that Eva likely developed her infection from the use of unsanitary tools. He also noted that Eva's baby had suffered a severed scalp due to the crude use of forceps on its skull during labor. With all this evidence taken into consideration, it would seem that Lila and William were just about done for. But shockingly, this wasn't the case. The two defended themselves and were actually acquitted of their charges. Lila and William would continue to see great success in the following years, and would even purchase expensive cars and build their business even larger. This was until 1945, when a new amendment to the Maternity Boarding House Act was introduced. This new amendment broadened the requirements for maternity companies to engage in business, and as a result, Lila and William had to renew their license. At this point, it was well aware to the health department workers that the Ideal Maternity Home was downright horrible when it came to their cleanliness. Babies had also been found to be 50% lighter than average when born at the company. As a result, their license renewal was obviously revoked. The two would continue to attempt to sell babies without a license for about a year. This was until the two were caught attempting to sell babies illegally to 4 American couples, and as a result, they were tried and convicted of perjury as a result. Local newspapers caught wind of this scandal, and given the sheer size of the Ideal Maternity Home at this time, they began to tell of the Young's shady dealings. Lila, in all of her pride, hated her name being the victim of supposed slander and counterattacked with a $25,000 lawsuit against the local newspaper. This act of pride only caused Lila's situation to worsen, as witnesses were called to testify against the Youngs, and as a result, the maternity home closed by 1947. By the end of the lawsuit, Lila and William were bankrupt, and as a result, decided to skip town and move to Quebec. The Ideal Maternity Home was then rebranded to a hotel, but would burn to the ground in 1962, 15 years after its closure. That same year, William Young would die of cancer, and 7 years later, in 1969, at the age of 70, Lila would die of leukemia. This is an unfortunate ending to this tragedy, as one could say that Lila and William did get away with it, as neither of them ever saw the inside of a jail cell. And while I'd like to say that their reputations have been tarnished, this story is not well known, so I'm not sure if that's even true. The surviving babies of the Ideal Maternity Home are now within their late years of life, and have worked towards providing each other with a support system. Many of these victims have reconnected across areas of Canada and the United States, and have created support groups where they can discuss and vent about what happened to them as babies. It's estimated that 600 babies died within the walls of the Ideal Maternity Home, their futures stripped from them while their mothers were never able to see them grow up. Now in present day, a monument stands where the Ideal Maternity Home once did. A beacon of both remembrance for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and a tragic tribute to the lives lost in that dreaded home. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing and checking out one of my other videos. Goodbye.